Every generation has a defining event, a national tragedy that everyone in the country feels, remembers, and tells the next generation. This tragedy also pulls the country together under common ideas and goals. These tragedies create grit and unity as Americans do courageous things to fight back. Here are a few of those events.
In 1942, it was December 7th, the day that will forever live in infamy. American naval forces in Hawaii were suddenly and deliberately attacked by the Empire of Japan. It was on that day that America joined World War II on the side of the Allies, fighting the Nazis in Germany, the Fascists in Italy, and the Empire of Japan.
In 1963, it was November 22nd, while riding in a motorcade in Dallas, President John F. Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. Where were you when you heard the news? Became the question all Americans asked each other, and everyone knew what the question meant.
Not long after, in 1968, the nation's civil rights leader, the one that inspired and challenged the nation with his I Have a Dream speech, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated in Memphis. Many feared the civil rights movement was over.
20 years later, in 1986, school children across America watched as a teacher in an astronaut uniform walked onto the Space Shuttle Challenger. With hope and pride, everyone watched the wonder of the liftoff. Then, suddenly, it exploded on live television. The horror of that day is something we could ask our parents about.
Then on a beautiful Tuesday morning at 8:46 a.m., September 11th, 2001, a commercial aircraft crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. It was one of the two tallest buildings in the United States. Within moments, all the news services began live coverage. They discussed how an accident could happen. Commercial pilots are better than that.
At 9:03 that day, much of the Americans were watching the North Tower burn and wondering how they were going to get people out. Another plane crashed into the South Tower. Immediately, all of the Americans knew that this was not an accident. The whole world started watching.
Barely half an hour later, at 9:37, another plane crashed into the Pentagon, the nation's military headquarters near Washington, D.C.
At 9:59, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed.
Within minutes, at 10:03, reports of another plane crashing into a field in Pennsylvania. Later we learned it crashed because people on the hijacked plane fought back. They rushed to the cockpit to stop the hijackers from using the plane and their lives as weapons. Most believe that Flight 93 was headed for the U.S. Capitol.
At 10:28, the North Tower collapsed.
The airspace above America was closed completely for days. Because we didn't know if the attack was over, planes arriving to North America from all over the world were forced to land. Elsewhere in Gander, Nova Scotia, Canada, a town of a few thousand people, but really big airports, hosted 6,700 stranded passengers for 5 days, in homes and all public buildings. 10 years later, this event inspired the hit Broadway musical, Come From Away.
America was now at war, but we did not know with who had done it, and why.
3,000 people died that day in airplanes, buildings, and trying to rescue the trapped, including 343 firefighters and 71 police officers who died that day trying to save people from the burning buildings.
All bridges and tunnels going in and out of New York City were closed out of fear that bridges would be the next target. Private and public watercraft, tugboats, yachts, fires sprung into action to evacuate 500,000 people from Lower Manhattan that day, and targets boats and since and British resources have started soldiers at Duncan in 1940.
The former World Trade Center was renamed by all as Ground Zero. For weeks, the pile burned and more of the surrounding buildings collapsed. Thousands came to help the rescue and recovery work, including iron workers, structural engineers, heavy machinery operators, carpenters, cement masons, electricians, machinists, plumbers, and pipe fitters, riggers, steelworkers, truckers, American Red Cross volunteers, and 400 rescue dogs. Later, some of these brave people also died from lung and other illnesses from exposure to chemicals. The pile was a toxic soup of burning materials.
By that evening, we learned a little-known terrorist group called Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, was responsible for the attack. This group had planned and executed the attack from Afghanistan. 19 hijackers armed with box cutters stormed the cockpits of 4 aircraft and flew them into buildings.
Lines formed outside of blood banks with people eager to donate blood. Millions of dollars poured into the charities to help those who had lost loved ones or support the ongoing rescue and recovery.
The American response was to change many of the rules for airline security, freeze finances, assets of all known affiliates of all Quaso and similar terrorist organization, and with the support of all the NATO allies, Great Britain, France, Germany, Poland, Australia, and many more countries, the Great War on Afghanistan. The fight was called the War on Terrorists. 10 years later, American force found Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. He was killed in the attack on his command.
One World Trade Center was rebuilt as a single tower and officially opened in Manhattan on November 3, 2014.
Tomorrow marks the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Now you know the story. This generation's defining event might be the day school closed for COVID in March of 2020. Maybe it is something else. You have survived the events of March 2020. America survived 9/11. May the tragedies we experience together bring us closer together and remind us of what is important.